Welcome. This is our third episode and it's titled Our History with Water. And when I say our, I mean not Elena and my history, but our history as a species. And we had the last episode, we talked about where's water coming from. And we figured out it's coming from outer space. We talked a little bit about that. We're never going to lose water because we have a permanent water cycle. And we looked at our ancestors, trying to figure out if we had an aquatic past, like the theory of the aquatic ape, might recommend it. It turns out we do not have an aquatic past, and we developed in the savanna. And Elaine, can you tell us a little bit how did we develop in the savanna? Can you enlighten us a little bit?
Yeah, and this builds on our last episode where we talked a bit about this. And I want to mention that it's not that we definitely didn't have an aquatic ancestor. It's just that the data supports evolving in grassland kind of more evenly. So there's more evidence that kind of puts us there. So the idea is that we used to dwell in trees. We spent most of our time in trees. Our bodies were adapted to moving through trees and eating up in the trees and finding safety in trees. And one of the major ideas now is that as the climate changed and as our environment dried out, is sort of in Eastern Africa, where a lot of these ideas have been developed, that we had more and more grassland, and that we started to move out from the trees and onto the grassland. There's debate about when we stood up on two legs. So did we stand up on two legs and then move out into the grassland, or did it happen the other way around? So there's still a lot of debate about the timing of all of this. But the idea is that being bipedal freed our hands up to use tools, that being on 2 feet is actually a really efficient way to move through the world. We run very efficiently. Some idea that maybe it helped us see over the grasses for potential predators. But in some ways, our bipedal past, or when we went from being 4-legged to 2-legged, is still under debate. People are still trying to figure out exactly how and why that happened.
Is still the consensus that Homo sapiens developed around 200,000 years ago. So us, Homo sapiens, our species evolved around 200,000 years ago with many, many ancestors, but us is about 200,000 years. Is this still the current thinking?
Yes, again, with all kinds of caveats, because every year people find new fossil evidence in unexpected places. But the general idea is between 100 and 200,000 years ago, our species, Homo sapiens, evolved. But keep in mind that if you think about our evolutionary past, it was like a giant bush, a web of lots and lots of different species, that some of which went extinct and dead-ended, others that eventually led to Homo sapiens. So there were a lot of different species at play. And in fact, when we first evolved, we shared, and actually until about 40,000 years ago, we shared the planet with multiple Homo species. So we've only been alone in our genus, in the Homo genus, for the last 40,000 years. So yeah, roughly 100 to 2,000 years ago, we evolved and made multiple, we moved out of Africa sort of multiple times in multiple migrations.
Yeah, so it looks like we got lucky because, as you mentioned, many of our parallel developments didn't make it all the time and died out. And I think there's a theory that even we had some very, very significant bottlenecks. And so we developed, as Elaine was saying, in the savanna, in the grass, and then there was a glacial phase. I think it was called MIS6, and the land became very dry, almost uninhabitable, and it put a lot of pressure on the very early humans. And what we see in some recent discovery are caves in South Africa. And when they started excavating the caves, they found out that Homo sapiens lived there from probably about 190,000 to 123,000 years ago. And this also coincides with a bottleneck. And there are, again, different numbers thrown out, but some people say Homo sapiens was down to a group of maybe a couple of hundred individuals. The largest number I've seen of is 10,000. And I think this also coincides with the mitochondrial DNA that really shows a bottleneck. Again, Elena, is this current thinking?
Yes, so I've also heard there are multiple theories about exactly what caused the bottleneck, but we can look at the current genetic diversity of people on the planet, and we can make estimates about our past that way. So we can make guesses about when we might have originally evolved, how many individuals might have been contributing to that gene pool. So another theory I've heard is that there was a volcanic eruption that could have dramatically affected the climate and essentially led to poor conditions for life and for a bottleneck at that point. But to be honest, I'm not, these ideas keep changing, which is actually why I teach in this field, in part because I really, really love being pushed to read about all of the new discoveries. So you think, well, we figured it out. We know how we evolved. In fact, no, the story does change year by year. What we know pretty much for sure is that our species evolved in Africa, and that then we've sort of made these multiple migrations out of Africa. But there's evidence now that we interbred potentially with at least 2 other species, Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So we have evidence in our DNA that we basically were hybridizing with these other groups. They discovered a species of, or sort of a dwarf species of Homo on a small island, Indonesian island. So like I said, every year there are new discoveries that make us realize that this is a really complex history.
So hopefully we will continue having discoveries here. But I still want to go back to those caves in South Africa. They're currently very close to the ocean. The ocean is right in front of them. And they were inhabited by Homo sapiens. And the interesting thing is that they moved away from the grass. They also discovered the ocean and the many, many resources the ocean has. And they basically had water frontage for thousands of years. Because of the climate change and the ice changes, the water was sometimes right in front of the caves, and sometimes the water was up to 100 kilometers away because the ocean levels fell, and there was a pretty shallow flat area, kind of a reef in front of the cave. So it shows me that we really utilized, and you can see this in the leftovers in the caves. We utilized shellfish, hunting fish, collecting seaweed and all those kind of things, and also use some of the root crops around the area to sustain probably a very small group of people. What I also think is very interesting to see is how the environment changed over time. People lived there probably 50, 60,000 years, and sometimes they had oceanfront property and sometimes they had to walk 100 kilometers to this. So that you also need to know when is low tide, plan your things. So I think that's kind of a really, really interesting concept of where we could have evolved. And what I like most about is that it has something to do with water. So maybe it wasn't so strong, the aquatic phase, but it was the phase that we grew up, so to speak, in South Africa, very close in vicinity to water. So maybe that makes us so comfortable. And that's why we strive for oceanfront properties or, lakefront properties even today.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if I would say we have some, some preconceived need to be by the water for aesthetic reasons, but I think obviously our need for water, the need to have fresh water for sustenance, and also the rich nutrients in fish. So once humans were able to discover this resource and figure out how to fish and how to access this resource, it would have been a really important part of the diet. In the aquatic ape theory, one idea is that, well, part of the reason that human brain size increased was from the omega 3s, so that from eating so much fish, basically, that allowed brain size to increase. And in fact, it doesn't really look like that makes sense, because it's not just that our brain size increased, it's that the many other aspects of our brains changed at the same time that isn't consistent with that idea. But I think the bottom line is, even if we didn't have a phase where we were living in the water, right, that looks pretty unlikely, we've always had an affinity for it because it's been able to not only give us fresh water, but even along oceans, being able to access those fish and other marine resources has been really central to us.
Mm-hmm. And not to forget shellfish. I think shellfish is, we see all these movies, someone get marooned on a remote island, and the first thing they do is get a stick and try to catch some fish. If they would take a stick and just dig a little bit in the sand, for the next 10 years, they could eat shellfish of various varieties, because they're very, very abundant. So I think shellfish is also something that sometimes overlooked. We focus on fish, but there are many other marine resources. So when we talk about the people, let's say from 200,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, we're talking about small groups of people, maybe 100, 120 people, meeting other peoples very seldomly, but still interchanging with other groups and living in small bands. But everything changed about around 10,000 years ago. Isn't this the case, Elena?
Yes, so absolutely. So we, in our very early evolution and development, we lived mostly nomadically or maybe semi-nomadically. So there may have been cases where groups settled for a period of time and then would get up and move to where the resources were. And about 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago, we start to see evidence for domestication and agriculture. So essentially, humans started to figure out how to harness living things like plants and animals, and to shape them using what's called artificial selection, to domesticate them so that those food items would be readily available to everybody. So basically what this meant is that individuals could start to invest in one location. They could start planting crops, tending them. This was no doubt a gradual process. It wasn't overnight, but that it might have gradual in the sense that they may have been just going back to where they knew seeds would grow the next year without planting them themselves, and they would start to learn the connection between the seeds and the product. And eventually you get to a place where larger and larger settled communities are developing, where people are starting to stay in one place, and where there starts to be a division of labor, right? Where people become specialists in particular things that nobody can know all aspects of that environment because everything has gotten kind of too big, where you start to see power asymmetries. You start to see, unfortunately, gender divides, right? Where women tend to be left with kids and men tend to have positions of power. So, right, around 10,000 years ago, we have this massive shift from more egalitarian small groups that, yes, are interchanging. So these guys are not in isolation. They're exchanging genes with other groups. But this massive transition about 10,000 years ago to more settled communities
was a dramatic change. I just want to go quickly back to the nomadic state when you drink, surface water or spring water, or you collect rainwater, right? There's a lot of evidence that people also collected rainwater. And there's a preference. I'm doing this for a long time, and I ask people what kind of water they like. And the first thing is tell me is they like their water cold, and the water needs to be clear. And again, I'm asking myself, is this something from way back? Because if water is colder, it has a less tendency to be contaminated. And if water is clear, it's a sign that it's also not so contaminated. So maybe this preference also goes way, way back when we tried to find and make a distinction, which water should I drink and which water should I not drink? And the difference between the two was life or death for you, because very few hospitals around back then.
Yeah, that's actually reminds me of a study I just read on taste, and why it is that taste has become more and more important to people when they think about water. And so this is relevant for bottled water communities, but also, or bottled water industry, but also for tap water, where municipal water sources are starting to think about, well, why is taste so important, right? Like, we know it's in this water, we know it's safe. So why are people discriminating based on taste? And it may go into what's adaptive for us, right? Like if something doesn't taste right, it may be a signal that there's something wrong with it, that we should be cautious, that we shouldn't drink it. When food is rotten, right, it tastes disgusting. We don't want to touch it. We don't want to eat it. So there's a lot to this whole relationship with water, which there may be sort of historical reasons why we would want to pay attention to it being cold and clear, and having a nice taste.
Yeah. So even before we settled around 10,000 years ago, there is archaeological evidence that water became really important for people, and it's associated with cults, and it became the center of god and goddesses, and it moved kind of into the center. You know, it was the part that, you know, rejuvenated life. There's cleansing. And if you look at almost all cultures around the world now have a connection to water, where they use water in their religious or cultural experiences. And again, I go back, last year I was again in Las Vegas and standing in front of the fountain of Bellagio, and I'm fascinated. The fountains are amazing. And then you look down into the water and you see little coins in the water. And almost to every fountain you go, you see that people throw coins into the fountains. You know, in Italy, there are movies. It's a very famous thing to throw coins into the fountains. And it seems like it's not something that we just recently invented when we got the coins. There is evidence of wells next to Stonehenge, which is about, you know, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. And if they started looking at the bottom of the wells, they found little trinkets. So people have been throwing little things into wells for a long time. So again, this connection for me with water, fascinating. We're standing at Bellagio, you throw a coin in there, and people have been doing this for at least 7,000 to 10,000 years, throwing things into fountains to appease a goddess, to make an offering. We don't know exactly what it was, but what they did was very fascinating for me.
Yeah, I think water has had a long history in people's spiritual lives. There's, you know, some of the earliest examples of bottled water are from sacred wells that people would make pilgrimages to, and they wanted to have some kind of evidence or proof that they had been on this pilgrimage, and they would want to pick up a bottle of this water. And so there would be we have wonderful archaeological evidence of this. So there's long been this association between water and spirituality and religion. And throughout the religions, there are always particular water sources that are central to those religions.
Yeah, so the question is, what was first, you know, bottled water or water? Of course, the answer is there was water. But I would argue that water in a cup was before there was water in a bottle. And there's some evidence from Paleolithic times, which is about 100,000 years ago, of stones. This is Europe, of stones. They have been carved a little cup into the stones and some rings around it. And they're assumed to have been there to collect rainwater. Probably not just for drinking, but also for cultural reasons. So there's evidence of a cup for drinking water, even so a very heavy cup, already 100,000 years ago. So again, this connection we have with water is very, very strong.
It's interesting, kind of as a side note about drinking cups, that, you know, for a long time, communal drinking cups were the norm. And really, it's only a recent invention that we would have an individual cup. So in the US, maybe the invention of the Dixie cup, you know, these little paper cups that people would use. But for a long time, people would share a ladle or some kind of cup that they would use. And then I guess it was with the realization that sharing a cup might spread disease in ways that people hadn't imagined before, that practice in general has, you know, has kind of fallen away.
Yeah, and talking about disease, you know, every time you talk about water, and the more we move into the civilization phase, you know, the word water and disease becomes, you know, very close, almost synonymous for each other. So quickly, let's go back to hunter and gatherers. Hunter and gatherers, small groups. The idea of separating drinking water and sewage is very easy to maintain because there's lots of space, a very small group of people. But as soon as we started settlements, it became really, really important to separate those two things. And there is great advantage made during the early civilizations of doing that. And many of those things got lost in the Middle Ages and only emerged much, much more recently. I think you have some examples for this kind of separation of sewage to civilization around water, how to get water into the cities and how to separate it from the sewage that hopefully goes out.
Yeah, I think the most beautiful example is Rome. It's most familiar, accessible to people, the Roman aqueducts. So there was long history before the Romans of shunting water from a source into a city. The Minoans did this in Crete by 1700 BC. They were storing water and they had flushing toilets. You had the Assyrians with the Qanats. I don't know exactly if that's how you pronounce it, but that's sort of by 700 BC in the Iranian plateau. And those are basically early aqueducts. Okay, they're a way to channel water from one place to another. Machu Picchu had an extraordinary system of diverting water to its city, but the Roman system is romanticized in part because we still have so much evidence for it, and because the aqueducts were built as a matter of civic pride. So the Romans put an enormous amount of effort into building spectacular monuments to their aqueducts, because the aqueducts were a symbol of the power of the Romans. And interestingly, a lot of people don't know that the aqueducts weren't built so much for drinking water, but for the baths, because Romans took baths all the time and they liked having water running all the time. So it was actually more for the elite and more for bathing than it was actually for drinking water. But I read a wonderful book by Trevor Hodge that is everything you'd ever want to know about how the aqueducts were built, what kind of instruments the Romans used, how they managed these incredible feats. Little tidbits that I could share. For example, most of the aqueducts are underground. We think of the aqueducts as being like the Pont de Garde, like these enormous, beautiful bridges, but actually almost all of the miles and miles of networks were underground tunnels. The other thing to note about aqueducts is all of it was based on gravity. So they would have a source of water higher up, and they would basically slowly make sure that they became lower and lower down to the final place so that the water would run naturally of its own accord through gravity. So really extraordinary engineering on the part of the Romans. And
I think you became quite an expert on the aqueducts now. So I think that it's not one, there are multiple aqueducts, right? They come from different sources. And somewhere I read that even in Roman times, there was a rating that says that some people prefer the water from this aqueduct versus the other aqueduct.
Yeah.
So this is the question number one. Question number two is, how much of current Rome, are they still using the same water sources, maybe through different channels? Is this still the same water, or did they completely change the water sources for current Rome?
I don't know about current Rome. So the one thing that I loved about this book is that it was everything you'd ever want to know about ancient Rome, but it doesn't say a whole lot about the present, except for the archaeological evidence that we have. What we do know is that a lot of the aqueducts are still being used. Not many are being used for the same purposes. A lot of them, they're walking paths. Some have been turned into actual bridges that cars can go over. Like the Pont de Garde now has a road that goes over. But so I do think that there are some cases where the aqueducts are actually still in use, but for thousands of years they were being used. There were I think there were 11 giant systems of aqueducts. The first one was built, the Appia, that was built in 312 BC. And then there were all these other ones built sort of subsequent to that. But yeah, I don't know about current Rome. What I also know is that there were aqueducts that came into the city, and then water was diverted through the Cloaca Maxima, so the central sewage system. So the Romans also figured out how to divert sewage. We need to keep in mind that when you have relatively small population and a ton of water, you can just flush bad stuff out. So it's unlikely that Rome was horribly stinky. Whereas, as you point out, you would think that, you know, everything would just get better and better, but actually conditions in the Middle Ages were terrible in cities because population size was rising, and people didn't understand the relationship between sewage and health. So people were mixing all of those together. You would have open sewage in the middle of the street. You would have people drinking terribly polluted water from local rivers, etc. So it actually, it's not that we lost knowledge, it's just that the structure of population changed to make the old systems kind of unsustainable. And we had to kind of reinvent another way to manage the problem once we had such big populations.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that from the height of, you know, Roman engineering, you move to the Middle Ages and you read books about the Middle Ages, and after page number 3, you can almost smell how bad it must have smelled. And for me, again, this maybe is not on the topic, but for me, this is kind of a sign if you start rejecting science and move more into other direction, this is what you end up with, is a city that's, you know, very stinky and extremely unsafe, right? You have cholera, you have yellow fever, you have lots of gastrointestinal diseases where water is the vector, and mixing the sewage with the drinking water is a very bad idea, because there was usually a well probably in the middle of the city or a couple of wells, and the sewage in the street, you know, sooner or later the sewage reaches your source and you have contamination for the whole system. So not a very pretty place.
I think the important thing to point out here is that people didn't understand the connection between water and disease. Up until sort of the mid-19th century, there was this belief that it's called the miasmic theory of disease, that it's in the air, bad air. Disease doesn't travel through water, it travels through the air. So actually, the word malaria, the disease malaria, just means bad air. So it comes, again, that origin of the belief that disease came through the air. There was also a belief that germs could sort of spontaneously appear, that they didn't necessarily come from somewhere, that they could just appear in any place. And so through experiments, through science, through a lot of work, this idea was broken down. So one example, of a great experiment that helped to break down that idea was Louis Pasteur's experiment, where he had flasks of meat broth that he boiled, and then he sealed. If you sealed that flask, nothing would grow in it, even though it was meat broth, right? But if it was open, then it would immediately start to become rotten, basically, to start growing things in it. So he was able to show, through a much more sophisticated experiment than what I've just laid out, that disease, that these things come from somewhere, that they don't just appear inside of a closed flask, they have to come from the environment. So that was one really profound development. And then another one was this enterprising man who discovered that cholera also was born through the water. So do you want to talk about that discovery?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. So we're in London around 1830s, and the idea was that cholera comes from bad air. And he could probably be called the father of epidemiology, Jon Snow. And again, you hear Jon Snow and you think it's one of the characters of Game of Thrones. No, it's not this Jon Snow. It's a real person, Jon Snow. And he got curious seeing all around his neighborhood people getting sick with cholera. And what he did is so obvious today, but was a breakthrough in many, many aspects, is he got a map of London and of the area. And wherever a person got sick, he walked around from house to house, asked people if they're sick, and put a little dot on the map. And once he was finished, after a couple of weeks, he looked at the map. And in the center of his map, in the center of all the dots, was a water pump, the Broad Street water pump. And he had this hunch, he didn't know it, he had no physical evidence, he just had this empirical evidence, and he said, let's close this pump. And people started using different water pumps, and cholera went down significantly. So with a map and a couple of dots on the map, he proved that cholera is not from the air and made water the vector for cholera. Fascinating idea.
Yeah, and this what I also find really cool about this experiment is that before that, people weren't keeping records. So there was no way to connect who died to what location. So this is also an example of how keeping data, keeping information can start to help people realize what the connections are between particular disease outbreaks and where people live, et cetera. And I think this is all the more important in an age of, you know, I would call it environmental racism, where we have people living in communities where they don't have access to safe water, or they have other pollution issues, or there's a Superfund site next door, right? That we need data on what's happening to be able to really make a clear link between disease and environmental conditions.
And also the stratification of the society also made a huge difference where you got your water from. If you're poor, you make just minimum wage. This was the, you know, early industrial age, so very, very poor living conditions for most people. So if you were poor, you had to go to the pump, take some water, and every sip you took was a risk. And maybe Elena can speak later about, you know, alternatives to water and, you know, the beer and the wine and the alcohol. But so if you were poor, you had to use this water. There was no way around it. If you were rich, you had water delivered to you from outside the city, from sources. And this was not in small bottles. This was in big, you know, 4 or 5 gallon, 20 liter glass bottles that came with that came on a horse cart, and you had a subscription, and people would bring you fresh water. Again, when you were rich, you probably didn't get cholera from the water. If you were poor, you had, you know, many diseases that come from the water. So this is almost a little bit of a start of the bottled water industry. In one aspect is the subscription to water delivery. The other one was as soon as, you know, spas were developed.
Yeah, I think that there's one little, there's an example from the Broad Street, the John Snow study, of 2 cases of cholera that were outside of that central area right by the Broad Street pump. And in one of these cases, it was a woman who liked the water from that pump so much that she would send her servant to go and collect water from that pump to bring to her. And then, of course, she contracted cholera. So in that case, she's not necessarily picking up something by the taste of the water. And as we mentioned earlier with the Romans, that yes, you had touched on this, and I didn't respond to that, but that the Romans also had particular taste for some water over other water. So there were some aqueducts that were renowned for being, you know, producing delicious water, and others that people, well, if we have to use it, we can. So people have long been able to taste and detect the difference between waters. But for a long time, just as you said, Michael, people with access to funds could have people deliver water to them. And generally it was the poor people without access to that ability to contract someone to bring water to them who ended up suffering the consequences of dirty water.
Good you mentioned the Rome again, because we forgot to mention, you know, if you just read a book or even watch a movie, you know that Romans had a taste for excess, probably a little bit. And it's also fascinating. So they had this really good water in the city, but still they wanted to have something special. And there are some naturally carbonated sources in northern Germany. We'll talk about what this is in one of the following episodes. But it was a very special water that was carbonated, something you couldn't get back then because there was no soda machine to make the small bubbles. So they sent people to northern Germany and had big jars filled with water, which is now Apollinaris Gerolsteiner, this area, and had it brought to Rome. So it wasn't bottled water, it was, you know, huge mason jars. But again, people showed very early on preferences for water. And I talked to someone in Rome and asked him, why is your coffee so good here? And he said, it's so good because I know where my water is coming from, and I matched it with the the way I'm roasting the coffee or the coffee I'm buying is roasted for my particular water, it's matched. And if you would take that roast and take it across the city to a different source of water, it wouldn't taste that good. So this is an early indication already that we can have preferences for water. But let's go back to the spas, because one way of people to stay healthy, if you're rich, is to get water delivered to you. The other thing is leave the city and go to a nice place. And this was the spa.
Yeah, for a long time, so there's a long history of people going to spas for health reasons. They were really supported by the medical community as being places where you could heal very particular ailments. So maybe one spa would allow you to get over your stomach ailments. Another spa would be good for headaches, right? Another one would be good for pregnant women. So there was a lot of lore around what the different waters would provide for people. And there's a bunch of ideas out there about what was so attractive about these spas. And part of it is that if you're in a city where your drinking water is probably or very likely to be polluted, going to a spa is a good guarantee that you're going to be accessing fresh, healthy water. So some of the ailments that people are recovering from at the spa are probably due to the poor water quality that they had in their cities. So wealthy people had access to these other sources of clean water, right? So much beyond just thinking about the specific chemical properties of the water. But the Romans they loved their spas, and there's a lot of evidence for, a lot of these spas are still in use. The Vichy spa in France, a bunch of the French spas have Roman origins, and also throughout Europe.
So we had this culture of people getting sick in the cities, rich people being able to avoid this by using funds to get clean water. And then came something that most people consider the biggest life-saving invention of all times. And it was the chlorination of drinking water. From basically one day to the next day, drinking water became safe to drink and was not a vector for many, many diseases. And you can look at curves of life expectancies, and there's an uptick. And if you put that uptick and you look at the date, it's the date when water was chlorinated. And it happened at different times in different regions and different cities, but it should not be underestimated. Right now we're opening the faucet and we drink the water. Sometimes we even don't like the water, but if you think back what it means that you have now water that in most instances you can drink, it's a fantastic evolution and saved many, 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 many lives.
I think this is another reason, part of the reason why we're doing this series is to explore why bottled water is controversial, and why people react to it so strongly. And part of it is that a lot of people on the planet do not have access to safe water, right? And we have the great fortune of being able to open our taps and drink that water and be safe. And that's, one of the leading causes of death of children is diarrhea and other complications from polluted water. So there's a lot to be done. And I think that is what galvanizes a lot of people and what sometimes turns people against the bottled water industry, because it seems to represent the bottling of this substance that we really should be focusing on making sure that everyone on the planet has access to safe drinking water. Obviously, we're going to develop this argument and point out that we don't think that all water is the same, right? That there are ways we can enjoy different kinds of water based on aesthetics, right? But we have to point out that we are in the really privileged position of living in places where we have access to safe water, where we're not likely to die or have our children die of these preventable diseases.
The chlorination of drinking water basically killed the first bottled water industry. So the spas, not only could you go to the spa and enjoy the water there were some very early attempts, it's even back to the 17th century in many places, where there were even glass companies built next to the spa that would make glass bottles, and people that went to the spa could take water with them, or at some point you can buy the water in in the area around it, the water from the spa in a bottle. And it was not meant for hydration. This was medicine, right? And you still see some of the brands now talk about that their water was medicine. Many doctors wrote certificates and say this water is good for this water is good for this. So there was already a thriving bottled water industry, but the bottled water was not for hydration and drinking, it was medicine. The bottles looked like medicine, and many of them were sold in the pharmacy, very expensive, even sometimes in small bottles. So this was the one bottled water industry. The other one was the delivery. As soon as the chlorination comes in, the delivery goes away because no one is paying for the water if the water is safe to drink. So this industry went away. And also the spa industry and the bottled water from the spa industry went away because of the chlorination. So this was the first bottleneck, so to speak, for the bottled water industry.
Yeah, I think also there in the United States anyway, once chlorination became the norm, it was actually very fashionable to drink tap water. So there was a period when bottled water fell off. The European bottled waters were no longer in demand because it was much more fashionable to drink this newly treated tap water with this magic chemical chlorine. We've since learned that, of course, chlorine, every story is complicated. We basically can't get away with anything simple. And chlorination also comes with some negative effects if it's not done in the right dose. There can be other chemical reactions that can be detrimental to humans. So there's been backlash against chlorination at times. But in addition to chlorination, we've developed other methods for cleaning water. So actually one of the original methods before chlorination was filtration. So part of the reason why a lot of natural mineral waters are naturally fairly clean is that this is water that's been filtered through layers in the earth over sometimes tens of thousands of years. So by the time the water reaches that place, it's been cleaned through all the layers. So that's a method that people have used for a long time to clean water. Chlorination was another one. Now we also use UV radiation, reverse osmosis. So there's all these different techniques that people now use. The problem with the municipal water industry is that it's very expensive to use all of these techniques. So sometimes when you're strapped for cash, you just chlorinate the water, but that means that other things aren't filtered out, or you may have these secondary effects from the chlorine. So it's actually a really complex world of trying to balance money and sort of outcome for governments, or also this is one reason why private companies started getting into the game and producing their own waters. But those are not the natural mineral waters that we're going to be focusing on for the most part in terms of tasting and thinking about the flavor composition.
Interesting book, and we put the link below there. It's the history of the world in 6 glasses. And it really draws a picture from prehistory to modern times by focusing on beer, wine, tea, Coke, coffee. And I think we should almost write a book, The History of the World in 7 glasses, because if you add water to this, you really have the complete history of the world. So if you're interested in those kind of aspects, you should definitely check out the book.
The thing the take home that I took from that book that I loved is that part of the reason why beer developed, wine developed, is that there wasn't access to safe water, right? And so beer and other alcoholic beverages had antimicrobial properties. They killed the viruses, right, that were killing people. So for a long time, people drank these alcoholic beverages because they were safer than water. But yeah, I'd agree that they need to add a 7th drink to the list.
So we talked about the first bottleneck for the bottled water industry was chlorination of tap water. As Elena said, it became very fashionable to drink tap water. This was technology, right? Imagine that you had a thing that killed you almost, and suddenly it becomes good. So this was technology advantage. People were very proud of drinking water, and that basically completely killed the bottled water industry and bottled water delivery. And it took until the 70s when suddenly drinking water from a bottle for many, many reasons, and we'll go into details on that, became fashionable. And this is where we're going to end the episode here, our history with water. It will continue, but I think this is the big arch. And what happened in the 70s was the single serving Perrier bottle. And I think that's on the route for many, many things to come. And we will look at that in a later episode. You want to add something to this, Elena?
Yeah, I think that we should mention that there was bottled water, but it was, as you said, mostly available through pharmacies, right? It wasn't seen as a beverage to enjoy with a meal. And that the transition to readily available bottled water that people would enjoy with their food or recreationally, that didn't really become super popular until later. I would say in the US, it took even longer, right? That Europeans have been used to taking the waters and going to the spas and used to connecting the sort of qualities of mineral water to their lives. But in the US, that really didn't become popular or really known at all until the 1960s, 1970s.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the conversations, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode.
Please join us next time. Goodbye.